We're up to chapter 9. Let's begin by reading chapter 9, verses 1 through 10, about Old Testament or Old Covenant worship. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship in an earthly sanctuary. For a tent was prepared, the outer one, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of offering. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain stood a tent called the Holy of Holies, having the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides with gold, which contained a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. These preparations having thus been made, the priests go continually into the outer tent, performing their ritual duties. But into the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the errors of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the sanctuary is not yet opened as long as the outer tent is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various baptisms, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. Though he begins with now, which implies a linkage to the previous portions of the letter. How does this section relate to previous parts of the letter to the Hebrews?
Well, we're talking about the tabernacle again. Although it's interesting, in this chapter, Healy uses the translation that has the word inner and out, the two tabernacles instead of tents.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the same as the...
A tabernacle is basically the same as a tent. The tabernacle to make a tent. In John's Gospel, he says that Jesus tabernacled among us. And one translation of that is Jesus made his tent among us. So a tabernacle, the question though, which we'll discuss in a bit, isn't so much tent versus tabernacle, it's whether there's one or two.
Right.
One of the things which we'll discuss in a bit is that often people argue that a particular writer is unfamiliar with the basics of whatever he's talking about, and therefore is kind of spewing words out of his hat. So for example, in John's Gospel, he says Caiaphas was the high priest that year. And many people have argued based on that that John didn't know how the office of high priest worked, because the high priest isn't appointed for a year.
Oh.
But they're missing the fact that he is, first of all, being ironic. He's implying that the high priest is a plaything or a puppet of the Romans. And after Caiaphas, who persisted in office a long time, in fact, high priests changed, were approved by the Romans, appointed by the Romans, and changed nearly every year. So there's a real meaning. So there's a problem when there are two problems. One, we often mistranslate, and two, we often understand literally when literal understandings are very, very limited. But we'll discuss that.
Okay.
That's one of many things in this section of Hebrews that are supposedly wrong and potentially disqualifying if you sort of want to engage in nitpick. But yeah, that's a good one. So how does this relate to? So he begins with the now. The now is kai in Greek, which is a connective. It is not it does not appear to be an adversarial connective. So it's a logical connective. It implies a continuation. So what is the continuation and how does it relate to previous parts of letter to the Hebrews? So how does this relate to previous parts?
Well, in the previous part of 8, he talked about establishing a new covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And he also talked about the high priest and the tent, and they're offering gifts and sacrifices, and that happens in the Holy of Holies, which he's mentioning in this section.
Mm-hmm.
So the tent, the Holy of Holies, the new covenant, the sanctuary, they were all mentioned previously too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. His in its context, his use of in chapter 8, verse 7, he says, "For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion for a second, for he finds fault." And then he has the long quotation from Jeremiah. So his use of the quotation from Jeremiah, although it mentions that there's going to be a new covenant, is aimed at showing that there are limitations of the old covenant. So not like the covenant that I made with their fathers. They didn't continue. I paid no heed to them. By implication, the laws were not in their minds and hearts. By implication, they had to be taught because it's imposed on them from without. It wasn't coming from deep inside. And so the focus is on his use of Jeremiah, although it does introduce the new covenant and its significance, is really used to show that the first covenant is obsolete, and so he picks up from there. So that's one linkage. The general focus on the old covenant worship, the temple system, also was basically really just briefly, although shockingly, referred to in chapter 8, verses 4 and 5,
Mm-hmm.
where he said, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly sanctuary. But when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern which was shown you on the mountain." So now he's going into more detail on the pattern, both of the structure of the temple, the tabernacle in this case, and to why it's a shadow and a copy. So this is closely linked to the previous chapter.
Mm-hmm.
But so the quotation from Jeremiah focuses on what is becoming obsolete and old, it's ready to vanish away. And he's talking there about the old covenant. Suddenly he switches from the covenant to worship. And if we, ignoring the current translation that we probably all have, he moves from covenant to worship and only returns to worship in verse 10 of chapter 9, which in my translation says, "But deal only with food and drink and various baptisms, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation." So why does he switch from covenant to worship?
God created us to worship him. So the focus is on, God was in the tent but God's still going to be there. But especially in the early, with the Exodus and all that and the desert wandering, God was in the tent. But now we have Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
who's in was visible and now up in heaven. But he's still in our current use of the word tabernacle.
Uh-huh.
Another meaning. Yeah. So that's what it's all about is the worship, ultimately.
And not the laws.
Right.
So he has to get them away from thinking everything is about the laws, because it's not. It's about worshiping God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's true. At the same time, he covenant and worship are closely coupled. Remember, he argues in chapter 7, verse 12, for where there's a change in the priesthood,
Mm-hmm.
there's necessarily a change in the law as well. So covenant and priesthood are closely coupled, they closely correspond. And actually, if we look at chapters 24 and 5 of Exodus, we can see that close coupling. So the close coupling is not his sort of theological presupposition or leap into fantasy or unproven statement. It's based on a reading of Exodus. So we have the law, Exodus chapter 24. But basically, we have Moses goes up to the mountain, to Mount Sinai. And then in chapter 20 of Exodus, God begins to give Moses the law. Not only 10 commandments, but there's laws about violence, laws about restitution, laws about sacrifice, um, laws about justice, laws about the Sabbath, the feasts, God's promise of Canaan. And so we have the basic structure of the Mosaic law given out. And then comes the religious ritual or the cultic ritual. And it starts with Moses giving the people the law. And in verse 3, it says, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and he rose early in the morning, built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the sons of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it upon the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So that's a ritual or a cultic action. It's an act of worship and agreeing to the covenant. And then what follows is that the covenant is sealed in verses 9 through 11 by we can read it. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. So the covenant is sealed by a meal. Again, that's really a cultic action in this context. So, and then after that, follow the instructions to build the temple and to establish the priesthood. So we have a very close coupling of system of worship, of priesthood, and of law in Exodus. So the author isn't making that up. And so that in turn means, so Healy says that a new covenant implies that there's a new liturgy, which is quite correct. And then we'll eventually discuss then how do we become participants in the new liturgy. So he says that now even the first covenant had regulations for worship in an earthly sanctuary. So the significance of that, even the first covenant indicates that it's divinely inspired. This isn't arbitrary. This is based on God's will, God's commandments, God's command. So then Healy argues that Hebrews was written before the destruction of the temple and poses the question of why the author focuses on the tabernacle and not the temple itself. And so she says probably because the Old Testament passages that most fully deal with the organization and liturgy are from the Torah and especially Exodus. So on the whole, although I haven't, done a, huge numerical count, my sense is that that's a minority opinion, and that most commentators believe that Hebrews was written after the destruction of the temple, and in some cases, relatively long after the destruction of the temple. So, what do we think about her argument, or what are what are the arguments that we can think of one way or the other? What seems most likely? A major argument that I believe it was written after 70 focus on is the fact precisely that he talks about the tabernacle and nowhere in the course of Hebrews mentions the temple. And then also in verse 9:1,
Right.
it says the first temple had, or the first covenant had, in the past tense. So, what about that? What do we think?
I remember there was something back in 7 or 8 that made us think that it was written after the destruction of the temple, too. I have to go back and see what that was.
In general, one of the things we have to be very careful about, is examining dating, and particularly, especially in modern scholarship, there's a tendency to push dates as late as possible.
Mm.
And one of the kind of implications of doing that is that you can add all kinds of extraneous considerations. So, for example, the typical view that's current, the majority view, pretty much the overwhelming view now, is that Mark's gospel is the original one, that Matthew and Luke come a good deal later, that certainly Matthew and Luke are written after the destruction of the temple, and that in many ways in their gospels they're focusing on conditions, issues that are unique to their time, and in many ways unrelated to Jesus at all. And so that becomes, very speculative, because we're making assumptions about the conditions that they're addressing when we're not sure what those conditions are. And we're also, really moving away from patristic interpretation, which is acceptable if there are compelling reasons for it. So for example, in the Eastern tradition, it was generally believed, in the Eastern Church, it was generally believed that Paul wrote Hebrews, and now no one believes that, or almost no one believes it. And it seems fairly conclusive that Paul didn't. But nevertheless, one has to be careful there, because patristic testimony, has a certain validity that you can only overturn if there's a really solid reason. And when our reasoning becomes circular, and so we justify the date based on the conditions that we believe are unique to the audience to which the author is writing, which we don't know, or we're surmising, we end up with circular reasoning. And that is very problematic. And it's also, in many ways, part of a kind of a broader attack on faith that comes from Christian scholars, which is interesting. So before or after, and why?
I'm thinking one of the things it talks about is God making a more perfect tent, not made with human hands,
Uh-huh.
that the sanctuary is now in heaven. And I'm thinking that he might, he's talking to the diaspora. So it wouldn't be the people that would have originally gone to the temple anyway. And I think what he's saying, and if the temple's gone, nobody would be going to the temple these days. But there's
Mm-hmm.
a different way of worshiping, a better worship place for worshiping now.
Yeah, although given that he's writing for the diaspora, or Jews in the diaspora, many have never been to the
Right.
temple. And so to critique the old covenant by using the temple would be largely meaningless for them, whereas all Jews are familiar with the tabernacle, and all Jews are familiar with the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement, whether you're in the diaspora or not, is the most solemn feast in Judaism. So you're going to be familiar with it. So, you can argue probably both ways that can be used as an argument for uh, both pre and post 70 dating. But so he uses past tense in chapter 9, verse 1. Remember, he says, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. That implies that what is obsolete and growing old still exists. It's just still hasn't vanished away. It's still around.
But is that the covenant or is that the temple?
That's the covenant. Remember, they're closely bound.
Yeah.
And then in verse 9 of chapter 9, he talks about the present age. He says, the way into the sanctuary is not yet opened as long as the outer tent is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. So that suggests that the present age is still very much with us. The temple also, for many Jews, can be an object of contention. So for some Jews in the diaspora and in the Holy Land, it was seen as now becoming controlled by the Romans before the destruction of the temple. And in fact, the Romans appointed the high priest. So to focus on the temple would have been a mistake. He also, much of his argument, all of the symbols of the old covenant point forward to the new covenant. All of the symbols of worship in the old covenant, the temple system, point forward to Christ. And the problem is that some of those symbols don't exist. Some of those things don't exist in the temple system. So Aaron's rod that budded isn't there. The only thing in Solomon's temple was the Ark of the Covenant, and then that's gone. So in the second temple, there's a rock, a stone. Well, yeah, no Ark of the Covenant, and detail um, about the temples is very sparse. So to so there would almost literally be little to nothing to say if he were to focus on the temples as opposed to the tabernacles, since the Torah deals with the tabernacles and tabernacle, not plural, and that forms the basis of worship rather than for both the temples and the tabernacle. And also, remember his focus here is on Jewish Christians who are thinking of returning to the Old Covenant. And a central part of the Old Covenant is worship and the priesthood. And he focuses on that heavily. And so remember, we've been examining how this is a really closely integrated, tightly woven work. So it's mind-boggling. So he's arguing there's a close relationship, that they're tightly coupled, liturgical worship and covenant. He's arguing that people shouldn't return to the old system. If liturgical worship doesn't exist, as it didn't after 70, you could be certain he would mention it, though we wouldn't have to examine the tense of the verb to be or whatever. Mm-hmm. That he would mention, hey, you're going back to a covenant that is gone. The temple is gone. There's no worship. All there can be are individuals, and we discussed in one of our sessions that his concern is with the people of God as a whole. His concern is with liturgy. He's not concerned with the individual worshiper. It's as a people of God that we approach God, not as individuals. And so without a priesthood and a temple system and a system of sacrifice, you can't do that.
Well, all you could do is go back to just the individual families.
Yeah, or
with the father of the family being the yeah,
right. But that didn't seem to work very well.
To begin with, yeah.
Or you can abandon Yahweh altogether. So, and then also, as we've seen throughout with all of his quotations from the Septuagint, if we would, so Hebrews is fundamentally a work of theology, and in modern terms, we would characterize him as a biblical theologian rather than a speculative theologian. So, for example, we just discussed the notion of worship and covenant being tightly coupled. And he comes to that conclusion, not speculatively, but biblically. And so he's a biblical theologian. So given that he's a biblical theologian, what is he going to draw on at the tabernacle, given that that defines the system of worship for both the tabernacle and the temple? So if we begin to, if we adopt the other position that Hebrews was written after 70, we end up with this kind of unfocused, sort of work that provides, I would say, haphazard insights into the nature of Christianity or into Christ's sacrifice or into the person of Christ. But those are haphazard, from my perspective, haphazard, partial, and kind of haphazard and partial. They're not consistent with really the closely argued work that Hebrews is. Remember, and I typically have, the Gospels, I believe, were all written before 70. And, so for when we were examining the Olivet Discourse in Matthew's Gospel, we treated it as prophecy. If it's not prophecy, then, it was written after the fact. Jesus didn't say any of those things, couldn't have said any of those things, because it's someone writing what pretends to be a prophecy. And surprisingly, when someone is writing what pretends to be a prophecy, they neglect to mention that the prophecy has been fulfilled, which makes it clear, which at least, makes the prophecy seem like a prophecy, if that makes any sense. And so if Matthew is writing in 80 or 100, as many people think, you would think he would say, and what Jesus said came true.
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, this stuff is being read for the first time to contemporaries. Right? So you're in 100, you're presenting as the words of Jesus, something Jesus never said. You should at least put an element of spin on it and say, you see, but he didn't do that. You're making up words in the first place. The element of spin is necessary to continue the illusion, but it's not there. So there's a really good study by John A.T. Robinson called Redating the New Testament, which argues that the bulk of the New Testament was written before the destruction of the temple, and that the failure to mention the destruction of the temple anywhere in the New Testament corpus really speaks loudly to its having been written beforehand rather than after, which is where most people now date it. So then the next issue is inaccuracies. And so we have, first of all, we have two tabernacles, evidently, when there weren't. We have, behind the second curtain stood a tent called the Holy of Holies, having the golden altar of incense, which it didn't.
Are you saying that in the temple there was not a golden altar of incense?
In the Holy of Holies, there was not a golden
Right.
altar of incense. The high priest goes and he but once a year. There, people have interpreted to mean that the high priest goes in and comes out only once on the Day of Atonement. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered which cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various baptisms, regulations for the body, imposed until the time of Reformation. So gifts and sacrifices aren't related to food, drink, and various baptisms. So he seems to be, way off kilter there.
So you're saying the author of Hebrews is way off kilter.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's been argued.
Okay.
It's been argued. What I want to do is examine whether, in fact, that criticism is justified. Because often, in terms of attacking scripture, it's argued that the author of a particular work doesn't know what they're talking about. So I mentioned the example of John and his saying that Caiaphas was high priest that year. We've discussed the course of our Bible studies numerous examples of that. That's the only one that really comes to mind at the moment, since I think I have an art for forgetting more than I ever knew. But it's a really common thing. People sort of seize on what appears to be a mistake. And, sometimes it is a mistake and big deal. But often the so-called mistake just reveals their own misunderstanding. And in the case of the Caiaphas thing, their own, stupidity. I mean, he's not being literal. I suspect that we're close to out of time. So maybe we should pick up there next week.
Which is where?
With his supposed inaccuracies. So we'll start next week by discussing those four supposed inaccuracies that aren't inaccuracies. So why aren't they? The first
So the first
supposed
is the two
inaccuracy,
tabernacles?
right?
Okay.
Whether there are two tabernacles or one. The second is the altar of incense in the Holy of Holies. The third, which is minor, is that Aaron's rod and the manna were placed outside the Ark of the Covenant, not in, but that's really trivial. Right. The third, that wasn't one that I mentioned. The third was it was interpreted that the high priest goes one time once a year. So he enters the Holy of Holies, then leaves the Holy of Holies. And that's not true. And then the final one is that sacrificial system isn't, that closely related to food and drink and various baptisms. And so those are, sort of the four bases for attacking the author of Hebrews as not knowing what he's really talking about. So we'll start by discussing that, and then we'll move on to the relationship of covenants, the arrangement of the tabernacle, what are the limitations of worship in the Mosaic covenant. So that's the plan for next week. As always, we proceed neither rapidly or in a very linear fashion.
We spiral a lot.
Yeah, we spiral a lot. Hopefully, it all kind of
That's
comes
good.
together
Yeah.
in the end. But
Yeah. That's what helps, rather than just being
spiral a lot.
linear, moving from one thing to the next.